You've landed inside Launch Street, the Business Innovation Podcast, where we interview top innovators out there shaking things up so you can innovate, differentiate, and get further faster. Since you're here, we know you're the type of person that recognizes the importance of unlocking your innovation advantage so you can compete and win. And now, your host, the person that has worked with leading companies like Disney, Procter & Gamble, Aero Electronics, the U.S. Army Research Labs, and Red Robin on upping their innovation advantage. Tamara Gontor.
What's up, Launch Street? Tamara here. Good to connect with you on yet another amazing week in 2020. I don't know about you, but I still keep signing dates as 2019, and it's February. You think at this point I would figure it out, but man, sometimes change is hard. And those are the little things, right? Like it just, to me, that just goes to show how easily we get stuck in these funny patterns and habits of something as simple as writing 2019 versus 2020 on a check or a document that I'm signing or whatever. I have the hardest time getting out of that. I have to actively think about changing how I'm signing things. It takes me a minute, and I catch myself doing it wrong all the time. And that just kind of made me realize, as I was kind of saying that out loud to you, it's just a funny intro, but it made me realize how hard sometimes change can be. And I think it's hard, not because we don't want to change. I think that's kind of some of the narrative out there in the world, is that like people fear change. I don't think we fear change. I think we fear being changed. But I don't think it's so much that we don't want to change. I think it's that our habits and our patterns are so ingrained in us. Our behaviors are so entrenched. You know, we have shortcuts in our brain that just does things so we don't have to spend the energy to think about it. And it's getting out of those habits and behaviors and actions that we actually have to think about it, about, you know, kind of changing habits. So that's my little short story for the intro. But I just, as I was doing that just earlier before I started recording this podcast, I just laughed at myself because I thought, man, some habits are just so ingrained in us and we got to really think about getting out of them. And if you think about it, right, writing 2019, that was 365 days of doing that. And I didn't do it every day. Obviously, I'm not signing something every day, but that's 365 days of doing that. Imagine how deeply entrenched the habits and behaviors are that you've been doing all your life, all your adult life. So when you think about change, think about the habits and the behaviors, not just the change itself. I bet you catch yourself quite a bit. So speaking of change, I had the great honor of interviewing Joe Jackman. So he recently wrote a book called The Reinventionist Mindset, Learning to Love Change and the Human How of Doing It Brilliantly. He's also the CEO of Jackman Reinvents, the world's first and foremost reinvention company, and the author said of that new book. He advises consumer brands, retailers, B2B companies, private equity partners, and so on how to kind of manage through that change and orchestrate insight-led reinventions for their business. We talk, it's kind of interesting, as he says in the subtitle, it's about the human how of doing it brilliantly. And there are kind of 5 principles to the reinventionist mindset that we go over that I think you're going to find fascinating. Seek insight everywhere, embrace uncertainty, create the future now, and obsess the outcome, and make momentum together. We actually spend a lot of time on obsess the outcome and make momentum together. They're so powerful and rarely talked about. And I think, you know, the fact that he has them in those principles and really called them out and what to do about them is going to be really valuable for all of us on Launch Street. All right, let's go do this.
Joe, thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks so much for having me on, Tamara. I really appreciate it.
So tell me, what's the one thing people would be surprised to learn about you?
Well, I have this obsession with flight, specifically birds and airplanes. And I've thought long and hard about why do I, probably 20% of my Instagram feed is caught up with images.
That's dedication right there.
Of things in flight, and much to the chagrin of my community who say, Joe, what's up with the bird and the airplane flights? I'm on planes a lot. It's part of my work. But there's something about elevation and taking flight and loft. I heard a great expression not that long ago that was, attitude is altitude. And maybe that explains a little bit of it. I just love that idea of lifting off and moving forward at a pace. It's some deep meaning for me.
So are you into the physics or the science behind it too? Because I like you, I travel all the time for work. And To me, it's magical every time, and not always in a good way. I'm a little bit afraid of flying, so I'm not always saying it's a fun magic, but there's something to me that's like, okay, I know it's splitting of the air and the particles and the lifting and all that, but to me, it's still like, how the hell does this even happen?
Yes, it's fascinating. It's completely fascinating. And when you think about it in birds, fairly light objects, it makes a little more sense. But when you're in these giant
Right.
planes, massive constructions, it's really defying not only gravity but in some ways logic. I'm obsessed. Actually, you mentioned science and physics. I'm obsessed with momentum, and it's related to to air flight. Just that idea of, if you remember back in grade 10 science class or physics class, the mass of some object times the velocity, the speed with which it's traveling, equals momentum. And that whole idea of Newton's law of bodies at rest tend to stay at rest, and those in motion tend to stay in motion. And that's actually really fundamental to transformation of any kind.
Yeah.
Putting yourself in motion, and in the context of air flight, putting yourself on a trajectory not only forward but up is really, really essential when you think about any kind of business or personal transformation.
So we might have to do a whole different podcast on momentum, because I've been studying kind of that concept of momentum shift, particularly in sports. It's pretty relevant to the timing of our conversation, because the Super Bowl is this coming weekend of the Niners and the Chiefs, right? And one of the things that I find fascinating to watch, and I wanted to understand, and maybe you can give me some insight into this too, is how a team will be winning, right? And then one person does one thing, even though they dropped the ball 4 times before, the wide receiver, right? They catch it in this glorious one-handed catch. So they shift their momentum, and then the team shifts and the game shifts. And I find that whole thing about how you can, on an individual level, shake off what happened and shift your trajectory, but then also what happens when that happens to an entire team too.
Yes, and how it can change in an instant,
right?
To your story. And what I'm fascinated is, how do you ignite momentum within organizations?
Yeah.
And how do you sustain it? And there's all sorts of fascinating analogies that are useful. Like, for example, have you ever noticed that a team that's playing from behind, they're losing, plays differently than a team that's protecting a lead?
Yeah, and in fact, wait, can I just interject and say just very quickly?
Yeah, please.
Titans versus the Ravens were a great example of that in the playoffs, because the Ravens came in 12-0, 7-0, I don't know, whatever their score was. They were like the leaders, and then Titans came in as the underdog, and they crushed it. And they played differently. Yeah,
they played differently. And I think that whole concept, it sounds like it's, that's the sports world, but that lives every day or not in businesses that we're familiar with.
Right.
And what I'm obsessed with as a reinventionist, a transformational catalyst is how do we get that going? How do we get that powerful force on our side, so that as we define where we're going and bring the entire community within the 4 walls of the business and beyond into that, so that it builds and it eventually becomes unstoppable. That's a fundamental. It's actually one of the principles in the book, the last and most important.
So let's dig into the book. Clearly, we could probably just go on a momentum alone, because it's so fascinating. And I do want to kind of just close this part of the conversation for our Launch Street community, just a reminder to all of us to what you said, Joe, which is that it really isn't just about sports. I'm obviously very excited for the Super Bowl coming up, and I can't stop talking about football. I'm not even a 49ers fan. I'm a Raiders fan, but that's okay. It's still a Bay Area team. I'll take it.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah, but there are just a microcosm that you can study. But I just want us all to remember, to what Joe said, I think is so important, which is that same, not just philosophy, but experience really does apply to business and to life. And it's so important to understand. And we see it visibly in sports. So it's just more tangible and easy. But I think what you said, that it applies to everything, is so important. So let's dig into your book. So the book is called The Reinventionist Mindset: Learning to Love Change and the Human How of Doing It Brilliantly. Let's start high level for all of us. What is the reinventionist mindset and why is it so important?
Well, it's a toolkit of sorts. Maybe is the best way to think about it. I've, at this point in my career, helped to transform or reinvent about 40 companies. And somewhere along the way, I started to jot down notes on how to do things that we were just talking about, like ignite momentum, get people really clear about, where we're going and the kind of choices they're making, not only in strategic terms, but also in personal terms, how they're sort of behaving through change, even more broadly, how they're thinking about change. And that set of notes became 8 principles and then eventually distilled down to 5. And I call it a toolkit because sometimes these things can be so abstract. And I have a very sort of high radar for, call it, I don't know, business bullshit, if you pardon me. I don't know if I can swear on
oh, you can. I'm okay with it.
And what I was really after, I mean, I'm built as a doer. I have a bias for action. And yet what I've understood over my career is that action with intention, where there's clear focus and alignment amongst those that are involved in any particular endeavor, is really, really fundamental to making change. And there's no surprise. It's not headline news that change is coming faster than ever before. And we really are not very adept as humans to thinking through it and behaving through it. And those principles were targeted at what is it that causes people to, get on board with new directions? What is it that helps them sort out and get past their fear, which is one of the great causes of stasis, of just the status quo being preserved and protected when it's not a happy place any longer. And so all of that got distilled down to these 5 principles. And we can talk about each if you like. And it turned into a book. And I thought, rather than being academic about, hey, here's the things I've learned that really do make a difference as people engage in change of all kinds, let me tell stories of where those insights were first discovered and turned into how they turned into principles and why they worked. And so the book is really an unpacking of 8 or so different case examples. First person, I was involved in each of these, and what they're attempting to do is reveal what the core principle of instigating and managing change is, and then it wraps it up at the end and says, here's how you can apply them to your own situation.
So I want to actually start by digging into some things you said and just around change, because I think you said something just now to the effect of, right, like it can be hard for humans, or we're not really wired to accept change easily. And I've been doing a lot of work on the kind of behavioral psychology side and change, and it seems that kind of people fall into one of 2 camps, and there's gray scales kind of are variations on both, right? You can either resist it or you can embrace it. Resist it, I think, can look anything from denying it to like actively fighting it to inertia in itself. I mean, that's a kind of a different form of resistance, to embracing it, right? Seeing change as an opportunity, rolling with it, kind of all the momentum side of change. I'm curious, in your work, what do you find that causes individuals to go one way or another, to either be on that resist side or that embrace side?
Mm-hmm. Well, I love the idea that you're introducing, resistance, and it does, as you say, come in so many different forms.
Yeah.
It can be kind of that passive, well, let's just see how this plays out, and then I'll make a decision. I think Jim Collins in his book, talked about that very eloquently, about those people who jump in and those people who sort of wait and see, and then the real hardcore resistors that actively undermine change. But it happens for a few reasons, and they're all human nature. The first is just simply fear, and that's multidimensional. Fear of the unknown. I know what I know today. I know how things work. I know my position in the world, and I maybe there's something better, but I don't know what that is. And it's probably going to be better if I just sort of stay where I'm at.
Right.
Fear of, things like reputational harm, or even, of losing livelihoods. I think a lot of business leaders really choose not to transform their companies, even when they know the time has come, simply because they don't want to be known as, the woman or the man who, led this company into change that didn't work.
Right.
And yet, as business leaders, what I'm encouraging people to think more about is, are we doing a good enough job assessing the risk of the status quo, of staying put? And, we're really, really good. And in fact, we're trained to assess the risks and the rewards of initiatives that bring about change. We almost never assess what is the absolute risk of staying where we are and doing things the way we have done them. And that calculus is really clear today, that, if you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance a lot less.
I like the way you said that. Right.
And so, let's start to weigh the risks of, doing things differently. And there's a way to do it that really decreases the risk of, let's use the football analog. Like, this isn't Hail Mary pastime. Hey, I hope this works out. Right. This is a really thoughtful way to understand, why do I need to change? What changes do I think are necessary? Where are they going to lead me to? How do I picture that place? And then what's the really thoughtful, methodical way to start to take steps toward it, and to get others to come on board with that? And that breaks it down into, pieces and parts and steps that really mitigate risk and actually take you into the future.
What I find fascinating too about what you're saying, and what I've come to experience, and what I try to work with our clients on too, is the kind of some of the exercises we have or workshops we do. And I'd love to get your perspective on this. Is sometimes, so that you're kind of talking about the risk of status quo, right? The risk of staying where you are. Oftentimes, those things that become competitive threats, we see as like a gnat, a fly, just it's going to go away. That's not a big deal, right? So, and, I think there's some very obvious examples out there, like, taxis versus Ubers, right? I guarantee you taxi guys are like, no, it's not. Like, that's just a fad. It's just a trend, right? In fact, nobody's going to get in strangers' cars. That'll go away. Or if I look at one that people don't really think about, coffee filters versus Keurig, or like the single cup, right? I'm sure the coffee, and I haven't worked with them, but I'm sure that conversation is around, hey, how do we make our coffee filters better? And then all of a sudden there's this behavior change happening that fundamentally shifts how we all drink coffee. So there's this whole part to it of, well, how do we even know what the real risks are to assess status quo? And I think that's hard.
Right. Yeah. And in that, what you're describing is 100% right. Like, if I think about, Blockbuster didn't become Netflix or Hulu, it was replaced by them. Right. Kodak invented the digital camera, but it didn't become, the iPhone and Instagram. So this discipline around what are perhaps the faint signals that we need to not only be aware of, but pay attention to. And when is the moment when we say we need to act into those possibilities, those potentials, even though they're not threats, even though they might be a rounding error on, big businesses that have scaled in some earlier version of a business model. But if you ignore them, you really are abdicating, I think, a responsibility, which is, who better to become the next best version of you, your company, than you? I actually think that should be mandated, right? Within corporate governance, to say, look, we're in this space, and it comes back to even what category you're in, like defining that more broadly and saying, we're not necessarily going to do things the same way, but we're very clear on why we exist. And that gives us permission. It's a bigger tent when you start to define yourself more broadly as a business. And you say, look, I don't necessarily have to do it this way if the world is shifting. But a lot of leaders, as you say, are just ignoring those signs, those signals.
So let's talk about how we change then and move forward and gain that momentum. So you mentioned there's 5 mindset principles, 5 reinventionist mindset principles. Originally, when I read through it all, I appreciated them all. I really wanted to start with the fourth, obsess the outcome. So can we start there and then go into the other ones? Because that one to me was one that I think is often overlooked in the way that you talk about it. I think you added a layer of realism to it that we don't often see. So anyways, I'm talking ahead now. I'm sure listeners are like, what is she talking about? So why don't you describe it, and then we'll dig into the other ones too.
Sure. Okay. So here's what I learned over the years, both as a consultant for many years, leading to my current job, which is a title I made up, Reinventionist, but also doing a couple of years, 2.5 years in corporate leadership at a big publicly traded company. I learned that strategy is simply how, the highest level how. I'm here, I want to go there, so I need to define how I'm going to get there. But when we think about that strategy definition, that process, it's inclusive of, and I want to go here. Define here, and you can do strategy. If you don't have a here well articulated, well understood by not just you and the folks that are shaping strategy, but entire organizations, then you can't go there. There is no, any strategy will take you there. It reminds me of a quote from literature. Well, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Good luck.
Right.
So I think that was Carol who said that.
Was that Alice in Wonderland? Wasn't that?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
The Cheshire Cat in the tree. So here's the fundamental idea of obsess the outcome. As you are, listening to those signals, paying attention to where the world's going, understanding that, hey, we really need to reassess, not only what we're doing and how, but where we're going. The more that you can paint a picture of that outcome as best you can from the starting point, it's not a moonshot. You can be off by a degree or two and hone and refine as you move forward. But I'm not talking about in business strategy terms that will take us to very rational, analysis, which is of course necessary, and it will often result in numbers. Here, our sales are X, and we want it to go to 2X by X, or this in this time frame. And okay, is everybody ready? Let's go. Let's go do that.
Not very exciting.
That isn't no, and it's not. One of the things I've also learned is that transformation of any kind is a very human exercise. Businesses are actually human constructs,
right?
That yield business results. They're not business constructs that sort of randomly spit out human consequences. So we need to appeal to people in a number of levels, a number of ways, so that they can say, hey, I know we're here. I know there's a reason why. I now understand the case for change and why we're going to, carry on. But if you think about that concept in literature, even going back to like religious books and so on, Bibles and such, the idea of the promised land. Even Tolstoy wrote about it, that the idea of a clear outcome of a promised land will take you through hardship. People will fight, very long and hard to move through all the difficulties which come with any kind of transformation, because they picture that place and value it. And we humans have a tendency to be able to move towards that which we can picture. And that's why that fundamental idea of let's get clear on where we want to go as best we can from this point, and now let's craft our strategy to take us there. And then there's other principles that will help you go there.
Will you give me a business example of a really clearly painted picture? Because I hear you. And in fact, someone, God, I wish I could remember the name of the guest. I apologize. It was like 3 years ago now, but he said one line that actually stuck with me, which was, nobody ever left a meeting and said, damn, that Excel spreadsheet was sexy. And that always, I just love that line. I thought that was the funniest thing. And so true, right? To your point about human nature. So will you help me paint the picture for me. Like, give me that example so that I can, if I'm listening, I am listening, but the listeners can walk away with like, I see what I need to change and how I do this.
So in a snapshot, let's take Staples as an example, and I write about that example in the book. What the research revealed, and just plain old conversations with people in various situations, was that those days of just selling stuff, here's a variety of office supplies, which are quite useful to companies of all sizes. Stuff, office products, supplies can be pretty much had anywhere. And the day when it was enough to simply have that broad assortment, well priced, if you're visiting an actual physical location, people that can help you make good choices, all of those things that gave Staples, a 40+ year run of success ended up being just simply table stakes. Okay, so that's a given. I can get whatever I want at a good price, can be convenient, probably delivered to me instead of me going to a physical store. What else do you have? Because now you're interchangeable with everybody else that sells that same stuff. So we went on a journey with the leadership team to dig really deep into what do people care about today. And what we found was surprising, that the, call it archetypal entrepreneur that starts businesses and scales them and, runs a small business themselves, owner operator, there's a lot of those folks, and that community is growing. But what we discovered pretty quickly, and a lot of data available on this, is that the age of entrepreneurialism is actually on us in a way we've never seen before. And it's simply because most people, I think it's trending past 50% of Americans, I think it's this year or next, will actually be defined as entrepreneurs simply because they have side hustles, side gigs, and that might be, hey, I Airbnb my apartment, when there's big games in town, I make some money that way, or I drive an Uber, or it might be something more significant. And what we found was, as I say, stuff they could get anywhere. What did they really want? What did they really need? They needed allies on their journey to become better, stronger, more knowledgeable, more connected to communities of people who are engaged in similar kinds of pursuits. There's an unbelievable learning curve to standing up your own business of any kind and making money at it and being good at it. And even things like how to sell, how to make sure you're not offside the tax man and regulations and such. So the point of all of that was we defined an outcome for that brand to move from, an office supplies warehouse to the working and learning company.
That's drastically different.
It's drastically different. And it's a much, much bigger tent. And importantly, it defines the outcome as something that to some degree you can say, well, I'm in that world, in that place that we're going, I'm going to be an ally to people that are on a journey to work and learn and grow. Okay, that sort of makes sense. Well, how do you do it? Well, some of it would be kind of a straight shot to say, yeah, that would make sense. But the rest of it is simply possibility yet to be created. That is part of the point, which is that place that business and brand is now headed towards is a very, very rich place founded on insights. And it will never tire of possibilities to create new ways and new propositions and experiences, just simply because it is a large and high potential space, but it's also rooted in things that aren't going to go away anytime soon. The journey to learn and grow as an entrepreneur, as a small business person, even as a teacher who's trying to do more with less and less these days. I think of teachers as actually entrepreneurs, whether or not they think of themselves that way, because they just do magical things with such little, tools and fuel to do it with.
So what I really appreciate about that too is I think the kind of learning and growing, that type of company actually matches the change in the world too. It's not a stagnant picture either. So, which I like about that. I like the idea that it's not just like, we're going to go from a a product company to a service company, right? Because then maybe services are out. It's more about how you operate in the world versus how you do business, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's shifting from the functional, I'm picking up your point,
Yeah.
from the functional and transactional to the
Right.
emotional and the benefit side of things, which doesn't go away. And finding new ways to serve that higher order purpose and place, in the world and a role to play. It's, I would say it's infinite in the ways that you can do that. And the thing that makes it so powerful is that it's not random. It's not spraying things around. Hey, I hope this will work or that.
Right.
It's let's make everything align to that, higher order goal or purpose. We are going to help our customers on their journey to work, learn, and grow. And we're going to do it. Yeah, and we'll do it in conventional ways, but we're also going to do it in new and innovative ways that we're actually just about to dream up.
Well, and I think what you just said there is actually really important about it's not always transformation isn't always a matter of walking away from the box that you built. Sometimes it's about taking that box and just simply changing it up completely, but you don't necessarily transformation. I think some people fear it because it's this idea of like, all right, you've built this garden, right? It served you for 40 years. And now I'm asking you to walk completely away from it, just abandon it and start from scratch. And I think that's a little bit frightening. I think people sometimes don't realize, or leaders don't communicate, that this is about leveraging what we've done and starting new. It can be a little bit of both.
Yeah. In fact, at the risk of being geeky, I chose the word, reinvention for a couple of reasons. One is that what it presumes is a which says we're going to go back at things, but the is focused on the original invention, and it's that continual return to relevance. And what I've gathered over the years is that every company, every organization has a code, DNA, if you will, and uncovering that DNA. Sometimes it's, I remember, working on the Hertz business some years ago, and we got into this conversation with some of the executive about, the DNA of the brand. And they said, oh yeah, we have a book that's written about that. That isn't always the case. A lot of times you have to dig a little deeper to say, what were the core ideas? Why was this business created? What was it then that was seen as an opportunity? And it's very closely associated with values. But once you understand those strands of DNA, you'll discover that they almost never go out of style. They never go out of relevance themselves. The manifestation of them is what goes out of style. And I find that a lot of times, just like humans, companies are hardwired to have this kind of, I'll get a little maybe out there and abstract and say it's almost like a soul. And our job ends up being, how do we transform that to reinvent, make that invention the most powerful and relevant version of it for now and for next and into the future, and to be so good at continually doing that. Reinvention in my dad's generation was, maybe you'd stand up a great business, scale, and every 10 years, even longer, you'd revisit strategy. Well, today it's a lot more fluid, as you know, than that. And it's just this, let's not only be good at change and embrace it, but let's be really good. Let's be like pro athlete good at change, so that everything is just fluid. I mean, that's the state I think we all need to aspire to. And I hold that out as you too can become a reinventionist.
I love it. So let's talk about the other 4 principles then. I'll let you decide the order of which they go on, because I thought they were all pretty interesting.
Thanks.
Yeah.
The first and most fundamental is seek insight everywhere, which all of them sound very simple and almost to the point that they can be easily dismissed, but they're really powerful when you understand how to apply them. And that just simply means, what I've noticed in a lot of companies is that they're very insular. Insular within themselves and their own organizations, insular within their category. If you think about, oh, hey, we've got some trade shows that we're going to go to, some industry conferences. Let's say the company's a retailer. What do? They go to retail conferences. what trade magazines to read, the retail trade magazines, and it creates this kind of echo chamber that reinforces the status quo. And the world doesn't work that way. I have an experience. You mentioned Uber. I have an experience in the world of personal transportation. Do you think I sort of hold that contained within that category? And
No,
when I go
of course
into a
not,
bank, or of course not. You travel with these expectations, and that's really, really important for businesses to be thinking about more broadly. And then just simply at a very human level, as business leaders or folks that are within organizations, what's inspiring you these days? What's catching your attention? What are people talking about? What are young people focused on? And that aperture kept wide is something that's so fundamental to transformation, because that is where the faint signals can be heard and seen, and you're tuning into things, and you're training yourself to play hunches. Because when you were saying like some of these things are so small, they can be easily dismissed, but play the hunches and say, I don't know if that will be something, but it might be. And I want to just test that a little bit. I want to learn my way into that a little bit. And who knows, that becomes perhaps, instead of a rounding error, it becomes the next act of a business. You won't know if you didn't participate in some way in that. So that's principle one. And it's kind of bedrock. The next one is getting at this whole idea of fear. Embrace uncertainty. As business people, we're taught to value facts, to hold them up high, and almost to say, if it isn't fact-based, you can hear that today in the business halls everywhere. If it isn't fact-based, then it's suspect. And I have a philosophy, balance facts and feelings, because by their nature, to be a fact, it's historical. It's an historical artifact.
Right.
This happened. Here's what the data is. That will not allow you to completely predict the futures. And hence, that expression, you need to create it. And how do you create it? Well, you create it on the basis of, I got to be open to the possibility that some things I try don't work. That's a fundamental in innovation. I need to be courageous in the sense that, hey, let's just push on. We don't know what this particular result is going to be, and we have maybe some facts that support a thesis or gave us some kind of insight into what might be. Let's push now further there beyond facts, and just have the courage to embrace the whole uncertainty of what might happen. That's a really important one. Those two principles as foundational.
Before you go to the next one, just very quickly, do you think, because I 100% agree with both of those, this idea that, first of all, keep your vision wide and open. And to your point, I mean, you're only as good as your customer's last experience. And that last experience could be with anyone or anything, for sure. Mm-hmm. Right. And it's funny how we go to work and we're like, oh no, we must only look in this industry that we're in, which is kind of funny when you think about it, because that's not how we operate in life. But kind of to your point about those two going together, that and embracing uncertainty, do you think that, or have you in your experience seen that once people open up the aperture and start to kind of look for those insights everywhere, that quote unquote uncertainty becomes less scary because your vision is so much wider and you're seeing so much more? So it's less scary because there's no dark corner that you're not looking around.
I love that connection that you're making between those two, and it rings true to me, because when we're insular, we look for evidence within our business or within our category. Oh, this works. We can be sure to put some money and some energy into this because it works. When you have a wider aperture, you can look for parallels in other worlds that may not be exactly the same in a one-to-one in terms of comparatives, but you're able to say, well, it's working over there, and those customers, when they're in that category, also are traveling into our category. So there might be a real strong correlation. That's a really good thought.
Huh. That's interesting. I hadn't put those two together before, but the way you said them kind of connected the dots of, oh, well, if there's less dark space, it's less scary, right? It's like lights on versus absolutely. Lights off, kind of. Okay, so going to create the future now. I think that's the next one.
Yeah, create the future now is really something I've learned from the tech industry. And it's so central to innovation, which is don't keep it in your head, don't keep it in the lab, get it out into the
So true.
field. Instead of like the 1.0 and then eventually you release the 2.0. No, let's do 1.1, 1.2. Let's keep going and iterate and learn our way in to the future. And that is so fundamental. The future isn't some far off place that's coming I remember like as a kid, to infinity and beyond. And, it felt so big and so like a rocket ship, there's flight again. And, the reality is it arrives every day and you're either participating in it or you're waiting for it to be done to you. And I would choose, that participative, let's keep things moving. And it comes back to our very opening conversation about momentum. The more things, mass, the more things you put in motion, and the faster you can get them out into the world and moving, the more momentum you can build. And, if you've experienced a business that has momentum, run one, and one that hasn't, you'll take momentum every day. It's a really wonderful thing to have on your side.
Why do you think so many future-driven ideas, thoughts get stuck in our head and don't make it out into the world? And whether that's because I say it to you, Joe, and I'm like, oh, hey, I have this thought, or I experiment with it, or I try it. There's this, massive brick wall that keeps a lot of people from getting it to that just one place of like moving to creation almost. What do you think? I guess, what is the big hurdle and how do you overcome that?
Well, that critical mass that I'm speaking about isn't only a critical mass of initiatives. It's a critical mass of belief and those that are understanding and they, with their heads, but feeling something with their hearts and saying, wow, this is really something exciting. This is worth pursuing. If you can create that kind of critical mass within organizations, it's actually the last principle I'll talk about.
Yeah.
You have a much better chance of making things happen. I'll cite I don't know if I should, in fact, I won't name the company because it would be probably just offensive. And why throw them under the bus? But I worked with this company and they were very, very strong leadership team, like really competent, in command of all the levers and dials of their business. And they ran a really good shop, not a broken business. And when we looked back at some of the things that they had attempted to do, and they were paused or were deemed to be failures of one kind or another, I encouraged a conversation about those initiatives. What were they? What was the intention? Why did they get mothballed or failed and didn't move forward? Why didn't they change the business? And in that instance, I remember one leader very, very kind of quietly revealing, we just couldn't come together and get aligned.
Right.
And and I thought that is a human factor against very promising initiatives that just scuttled it all. And I talk a fair bit about that in two stories I wrote in the book, reinventions, big transformations that didn't happen. And that is the root cause.
How do you think about, you said alignment a few times. So I just want to, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I want to ask you about this. How do you think about the difference between alignment and consensus?
Yeah, consensus presumes that everyone believes the same thing. Alignment is that everyone is reconciled to move forward in the same direction. That's the difference. I know it's a nuance, or it may sound like one, but I don't need to agree with every decision and every detail. What I need to buy in, if I'm a member of an organization that is embarking on some kind of change, what I need to buy into is some of these things we've been talking about. I know why we have to change, the case for change. I know where we need to get to. Now I not only know how, at some level, how we're going to do that. It's been explained to me. I've been ideally part of that in some way. And I'm not just sort of getting and going, yeah, that makes sense to me, or as a number, okay, there's a target to hit. But I'm feeling it. I'm saying, wow, that's pretty exciting. I want to be part of that. One day I'll sit on a porch and I'm going to look back on my career and say, I was there. I was part of the team that, that did that. And that fundamentally is what we need to be focused on when we make change or innovation of any kind. It's just super fundamental, but not well understood.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think, and thank you for answering that. I just think we confuse the two a lot, alignment, consensus, and it's human nature. We're tribal. We want everybody to be like, yay, and validated, we're all in agreement. But consensus really kills momentum, actually, I think, because to your point, we don't all think the same. That's rarely going to happen on your team. But alignment can be just as powerful because everybody's bought into moving together.
Yeah, just in the spirit of sidebar, I'll tell you a story where, as I was thinking about the book and how I would share these principles and such, I was encouraged to go back to the root of when did I start to think about change? And I thought, well, it must be as an adult in, the early stage of my career, or maybe sort of mid-career. But it went back all the way to my childhood. And my family was kind of an interesting democratic construct around everyone has a vote, and we're going to get together in family meetings and debate what decisions we're going to make collectively. And I'm sure, like, quietly, anything that was crazy, my parents had a veto on. But that act of, let's have a conversation about it. We want to do this, but we can't afford to do that as well. So which is it going to be? And it was genuine. And a couple things happened. One, because, I was the youngest of 6 kids, but because I participated, and this goes to your question around, is it consensus or alignment? Because I participated, I didn't agree with every decision that was made, not even close. My view was very different than my older siblings and my parents, but I was part of it. And we humans support that which we help create. And so I was on board, and I say, look, it didn't go the way I wanted it to, but I'm aligned because we did it this way. That's the central difference.
Yeah, I really like that. One of the things I often talk to the leaders I work with is because they're, afraid of, but, they submitted all these ideas, but we're going this direction. What I kind of try to reiterate to them is that people don't need to be right. They need to be heard. They need to feel valued. And there's a fundamental difference between the two. And I think that's kind of alignment versus consensus. I'm curious, if you were to wrap up or kind of put a package around the 5 reinventionist mindset principles, how would you describe them to someone to say, hey, this is how you're going to think, or this is the principles you're going to get behind?
Yeah, maybe at some level, I'd say, like, no surprise, change is on us as never before. How you think and act, behave through change is going to not only determine success or failure, but also, how much fun you're going to have, and how sort of, feeling that this is a choice, not a this necessary and negative thing that I have to go through. And I lay out in the book just 5 really simple principles. They're either 3 words or 2 words each, and then just explain how to use them. And I like to think of them in my own experience. I know it sounds a little hyperbolic or maybe even arrogant, but today I apply them, and my team does as well. And we do that with the leaders of companies we work with, and in fact, entire organizations, in such a way that I've come to believe they're the game changers of change itself. And if we can just draw down to what is important here, all innovation, all change, all business development, everything comes down to human nature and whether we're understanding it and putting, that unbelievably, infinitely powerful source of will and determination. And, are we putting all of that on our side, or are we letting that just sort of bounce us around and causing, failed outcomes and, terrible experiences? I write in in chapter 4 of the book, defining, I was an executive at a big company, and that company was in trouble and it was being transformed, and it was brutal. Like, I was shocked, like, to my core, how difficult change really is. Now, part of it was how it was managed, but part of it was just the very nature of it. And there's a way to do it that, look, change is hard, but as I said earlier, relevance is harder. So choose change, and then choose to do it in a way that is going to up your odds of success.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you've said a few times now that it's like, it's just so simple. Like, and I think in the beginning you even said it's so simple it could be dismissed. As you started to go through the principles. And I have to say, I was just having this conversation with a colleague yesterday about transformation. And she was sharing a transformation or an aha moment she had about her own behavior and how she acted. And it wasn't about change in the way we're talking about it, but it would create change in her life. And she said it was almost so obvious, like I almost ignored it. And we just had this conversation about how the best principles, the best mindset tools, the best transformations tend to be the ones that feel so easy and obvious because they're so true and so right and so in alignment with where we want to go or what we know is the right thing to do. And I think oftentimes we get bogged down in trying to make it complex or, my God, this insight has never been seen in the world. But the truth is that it's probably not good. That's probably actually a reason why it's complex and not simple.
Yeah. And just sort of drilling down into some of those behaviors and those fears and just cleansing yourself of all of that and saying, let me open the aperture.
Yeah.
Let me not fear change. Let me embrace it. Let me put things into motion. Let me I'm not going to bet my career or my entire wherewithal on any individual decision. I'm just going to get super clear on where I'm going as far as I can tell right now, and I'll just start taking steps by step, and I'll learn. And I'll understand how to refine. Maybe I'll end up in a cul-de-sac, but that's okay. I could just reverse and loop around and head down another path. And then eventually, what this is actually a lead into the last, we talked about, there is the story of the first four principles. The last one is make momentum together. And, we talked at length about momentum earlier, but the together part is worth, I think, capping all of this off, which is you want to do extraordinary things, whatever your ambitions are. You want to, get a company that's had a 50-year track record of great success, earning the right to have another 50 years or 10 at least, and then you can do it again. You really do have to do it together. There's nothing more powerful than that community of like-minded people that believe in the same things. They don't agree necessarily on everything, but they're directionally aligned and they're moving forward. And what I've seen, it's incredible in some of these companies, is just doing it in the way that I'm describing. I almost used the word preaching. Maybe a little bit of evangelist on reinvention, but doing it in that way, you'll actually start to see results instantly. And it's simply, it's the force of human nature. People say, well, I like this. I know we're kind of threatened and we got to change. I'm excited about where we're going. And I think the way we're thinking about getting there is really thoughtful. And by the way, they asked my opinion, in a survey or at a town hall. I had a chance to voice it, and I'm in. And the more people you can get to say, I'm in, it's remarkable what can happen before you make, more significant transformational change, like, hey, we changed our products, or we retooled our customer experience, or we reimagined the entire business. Before any of that is real, once people decide we're in and we're moving to the same place together, you can see performance start to change. It's phenomenal.
I'm so glad that we're kind of starting and ending on momentum, because it really is so incredibly powerful. And I don't think I even understood how much so until we've had this conversation. So thank you, or how it kind of plays with everything else. And I'll share with you a story really quickly before we have to close out, is that we do a lot of culture of innovation work, and oftentimes that starts with an assessment, meaning going in and kind of understanding where their culture is now, like what's happening. And there was this one company, and like you, I won't name names. We don't want to throw people under the bus, but it was a large, successful company. But what I found fascinating is why some ideas moved forward and some didn't. And when I looked at the ideas, the products really that moved forward, they weren't the best ones. Like if you put them apples to apple, or I compared them to the ones that got mothballed, as you said, it wasn't actually the best one. So I started to really dig into, well, why? Why are the less innovative ideas the ones getting pushed forward? Is it because the innovation is scary? And that's kind of all part of it. But here's ultimately, Joe, what it boiled down to. The people behind those ideas that were, I would call mediocre at best, spent more time getting buy-in and momentum than the people with the actually better ideas, because the people with the better ideas thought the idea should stand on its own. It's obviously the direction to go. And they weren't wrong necessarily about that, but that minimized their what they thought was the need to get buy-in, because obviously, right? I mean, look at the PowerPoint. It's freaking brilliant. But the other ideas move forward ultimately at the end of the day, probably because they were a little bit less scary. Like I think that was part of it for sure. But the other part was those guys just spent more time like getting momentum and getting buy-in. And I had totally forgotten about that until you started bringing all this up. But the power of it is really real. Yeah,
that's a perfect illustration. And imagine that's the difference. That's the success factor here. Is I did it collaboratively. I brought people in. In lots of ways, I think that archetype of the lone innovator,
it's a joke.
That drops the tablet on the table and everyone goes, oh, we must do this. Like it's a fallacy. It's, the best innovations are, and oftentimes there's complexity in innovation. And well, who better than an army of people that are all super excited and feeling like they co-own to make that, complex solution real. I think your point is very well taken.
So before we have to close out, although I feel like we do a whole nother hour, where can people go to get the book, connect with you?
Thank you for asking. joejackman.com is probably the fastest route. And there you'll find, your favorite retailer. There's links to buying the book. And it's pretty much available online and in stores across North America. And you can also follow me at The Human How on social.
I love the Human How name. I love that word.
At the Human How. That's really the underlying reveal, I think, in the book. Is just it just comes down to human nature.
Yeah, it's so true. So what's your final piece of advice for everyday innovators on Launch Street?
Well, it might sound a little self-serving, but however you define it, this idea of becoming that pro athlete of change, that, not only comfort, but competence, that openness, like some of the things I'm describing, you can characterize as a person. You can think about it as like, here's this person who's, on their feet, calm. They're looking very broadly at possibilities. They're very open to people's ideas, and they're curious. And they're looking to others to help them move things forward and make them stronger. And they are continually mindful of making momentum and how to build that unstoppable force. That's a reinventionist to me. And I would really encourage, I think honestly today, in light of what's going on, the world needs more reinventionists.
Yeah. That is a great note to end it on. We need more of us out there. And I think what you're really saying is all of us can be that. It's not for the select few. So I appreciate that about it as well.
Completely. What a pleasure to talk with you. I think you're right. We could talk for another hour.
I know. I was like, oh no, I'm out of time. Joe, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. We'll clearly need to schedule a follow-up. So it was great having you on.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Tamara.
Thanks for hanging with us on Inside Launch Street. If you know someone that is truly ready to unlock their innovation advantage, have them join you on Launch Street. Discover your innovation advantage. Build a team of high-performing innovators and ignite ideas and solutions that create massive impact. GOTO, launchstreet.com. Remember, innovators, if you don't take the leap, somebody else will.